Okay, hello, and welcome to this eSchool News webinar from on-campus to on-demand, keep IT safe and available for critical student access. My name is Kevin Hogan. I'm editor-at-large at eSchool News, and I'll be moderating this event. I'm excited to have you join us for what should be a very informative session. Today's webinar is sponsored by A10 Networks. A10 enables education institutions, service providers, and enterprises to deliver business-critical applications that are secure, available, and efficient for multi-cloud transformation and 5G readiness. Their solutions are used by some of the most demanding customers at the highest scale, including Tier 1 operators, large universities, and web giants. Before I introduce our presenters, I'd like to take a minute to go over some features of the platform that we're using for this webinar. Today's event will be recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing a thing. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on the Q&A box. There will be time at the end of the presentation for our speakers to address these questions. Also, there is a chat function that you can launch by clicking on chat. Feel free to use this feature to contact someone from the eSchool News team if you have a technical question, but please don't use this feature to ask questions of the speakers. If you have a question for the speakers, you can use the Q&A box that I just mentioned. With these housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started with our presentation. Our presenters today are Terry Young, Director of 5G and Service Provider Product Marketing, and Babar Khan, Technical Marketing Engineer for Enterprise Security at A10. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to Terry to get on with the show. Terry?
Thanks very much, Kevin, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining our webinar. Let me just tell you just a little bit more about A10 Networks and who we are. We are actually located in San Jose, California. We're about 14 years old, and we are very much a global company. We have 8,000 customers roughly, about 750 employees, and we serve customers in 117 countries. I mean, you see the different brands that we're listing here, and as Kevin had mentioned, we sell the same solutions that educational facilities can purchase are all sold to the top Tier 1 mobile operators, very large, other large service providers, as well as web giants, and to enterprise as well. So we hope to bring you a very global perspective on what some of the issues we see and some of the trends that we see from both a educational institution perspective as well as the large global network and enterprise as well. So today we're going to talk about what those global technology trends are and how we see them impacting university IT and their networks, how COVID-19 specifically has impacted the global networks and university IT, and how that globalization of education will change university IT post-pandemic. And what IT challenges can we help you address, and what are some of the action steps that can be taken now? So first of all, I want to start by making a statement about we very much recognize what a huge impact COVID-19, the pandemic, has had on education of all levels and all across the world. This is a global crisis. UNESCO has estimated that over 851 million learners have been affected. That's about half of total enrolled learners globally. There are 53 countries that are closed in total, and many that are closed partially, and this is a major concern to countries and to institutions all over the world. These are, of course, the children also that will eventually be wanting to attend university. I think what it's also done is highlighted the importance of education and the importance of having access to education. So while remote access may have been remote access to learning may have been an option in the past, I think it's pretty clear now that at this time, at least, it's very critical. And so it's really kind of, I think, will help accelerate a trend that we see is happening anyway, which is more and more remote learning programs. We see that as really impacting and accelerating, going forward post-pandemic as well. And access that is of high quality and also very resilient. So we'd like to just pause and kind of get a little bit of feedback from you and ask a poll question. Kevin, would you like to put the poll question up? So please just mark your response, and we'll see who our audience is and where you are in how you see yourself managing this pandemic. We are in California, and of course, most of our schools here are closing and trying to figure out how to reopen, as well as the universities. And it's been a real heroic act, I think, by all the educational institutions to try to cope with the current situation. Do we have any results back from that, Kevin? Yeah, so this is it looks like most of you are enacting some kind of hybrid environment, which I think was an ongoing trend anyway, combining on-campus learning with remote learning. And then some are still looking at remote learning only, and nobody suspended classes, and or just simply restated on-campus learning with restricted access to that. Thank you very much. All right, so let's just talk about some of the global technology trends that we are seeing from, as I mentioned, from our service provider customers, from enterprise customers, as well as the education institutions that we talk to as well. So there's a lot of macro trends that have a big impact on education as well. I'm going to talk about a few, and Barbara, my co-host here, will also talk to a few as well. The first major trend that I think has had a big impact on education as well is the move to mobile. Mobile use of mobile subscribers is reaching 70% of global adoption worldwide, which makes access for all kinds of applications, including educational ones, to a much greater part of the population. And more applications are being accessed via mobile versus traditional laptops or other types of access. What that means is that the volume of traffic is really accelerating as well. Because not only are there more people accessing content, the content is now more video streaming content that really consumes a lot of bandwidth. As 5G is being deployed, this will be accelerated even more. IPv6 is another area where we work with a lot of higher education facilities. IPv6 adoption the IPv4 and IPv6 adoption has been happening for some time, and like right now it's approaching about 33% of users are on IPv6. This is the global average. It varies a lot by country, so the U.S. would tend to be higher. Barbara, would you like to talk to a couple of these other items here?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Terry. So, as Terry talked about, the growth of 5G and these devices having the ability to generate more and more traffic, and the fact that we are moving towards having about 25 to 30 billion connected IoT devices by the end of 2025. That's just a huge number. Now, imagine that coupled with the fact that 5G is going to provide them with the ability to just generate more traffic. And all of these IoT devices are just so powerful these days. And if we look at some other devices like our cell phones and tablets, etc., they're more powerful than the supercomputers of 30 years ago. So obviously, these factors will create certain problems. And one of those problems that we are seeing in terms of security is DDoS attacks. We've seen a growth of over 300% in DDoS attacks just in 2020. And obviously this number fluctuates, but it generally doesn't go down. It's on a upward trajectory. And that's what's a little bit of a cause for concern, because when you couple that with powerful IoT devices and then how many IoT devices are coming online every single day, and the fact that those devices can be hijacked very easily, and we're going to talk about some of that in the upcoming slides as well. That just creates this gigantic problem, and we've actually seen repercussions of this already with some of the largest attacks on record. And it's just the beginning. So yeah, from a security standpoint, these statistics do look a little scary, but we're going to talk about how to solve those issues as well, so don't worry.
I thank you, Babar. And just lastly, let me just mention that edge computing, which includes pushing applications further out to the edge, further out to where the users actually are, is also a very dominant technology trend. And IDC has estimated that greater than 50% of new infrastructure that's deployed will be deployed at the edge as opposed to in a centralized data center, which could have real implications for those schools, universities that are considering providing more and more remote access or extending their campuses out into additional locations. So let me just kind of talk a little bit more about one of those trends, which is IPv4 and IPv6. And this is an area that we get a lot of calls from universities for, because way back when, if you don't know what IPv4 and IPv6 are, these are the protocols that are used to determine the IP address that you can use for any device to access any service, any web service on the internet. Anything that accesses the internet has to have an IP address assigned to it. So way back when the internet was first being born, and IPv4, that was the initial protocol, was created, there was lots of addresses, and a lot of the universities and other schools, research facilities, got a decent allocation of these IP addresses. So at some point, it was realized that we're going to run out of addresses, and so IPv6 is born. So IPv6 is now is the new protocol, and the industry has been pushing for migration, for moving to IPv6 from both mobile operators, as well as all the different web services and so forth. But for schools, they often have an existing allocation of IPv4, and often their infrastructure is IPv4. So, however, the devices that are coming onto the campus are typically on IPv6. So in any case, the question is that you have to do some translation between those two protocols. So even though IPv6 is growing rapidly, IPv4 is still very much alive, and so that's what I would like to emphasize, is that over 2/3 of globally of users are still using IPv4. And even John Curtin, who's president of the IRIN, which is one of the internet registries, says, the basic problem is that every customer wants to connect to everywhere. So as long as there are IPv4 only websites out there, IPv4 will continue to exist. So it may be quite a few years before IPv4 is gone altogether. So so educational facilities that are using IPv4 often have to try to manage their existing allocation. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The other trend that's kind of interesting is that because you can no longer get IPv4 addresses that are free, you have to pay for them on the open market. The value of IPv4 addresses has significantly increased over the last few years. And so some educational facilities have actually decided they have more than they need, or they've been able to migrate totally to IPv6. And so they're selling off their allocations that they have of IPv4. And MIT is, like, for example, one of those institutions that was able to do that. But the price still goes up. So again, makes it important for universities to manage their IPv4 addresses efficiently, and also to plan for a transition to IPv6 over time. Barbara, would you like to give us a little more detail about the DDoS attacks?
Yeah, so let's talk about the security and DDoS side of things. Terry gave us a good view of what's happening on the infrastructure side, but on the DDoS side, things have been quite intense. So we've seen a high frequency of attacks. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen a 300% growth in DDoS attacks overall in 2020. But it's not just the frequency, it's not just the number of attacks that is increasing. We've also seen an increase in the intensity of attacks, and what I mean by that is the duration of these attacks and how large these attacks can be. So you have this mix of high frequency and large scale, and that's just hurting people more than it did even 2 years ago. One other interesting thing that we've been seeing is that over 75% of the attacks that are happening are less than 5 Gbps. And what that means is a lot of these attacks, since DDoS is generally considered to be volumetric in nature, a lot of these attacks just go under the radar. They go undetected, especially if you're going with legacy solutions that don't have, that intelligent automation and, AI built into it in order to distinguish between good traffic and bad traffic. You are going to see a lot of these problems. And that's one of the key issues that we've been seeing, where people are relying on volumetric defenses, and they forget that DDoS attacks can also be on the network layer or the application layer as well. So, and those don't necessarily have to be large in size, or they just have to be more frequent, more consistent, and they just have to keep on hitting your systems in order to slow them down or just bring them down altogether. One other thing I want to talk about here, because this is a very key factor, is the cost of launching these attacks. Over the past few years, we've seen that there are certain apps that have been developed to launch these attacks. There is a lot of code available on the black market, and you can easily buy software or code for launching a DDoS attack for as low as $150 for a week. And I actually saw somewhere that you can buy 1 hour of DDoS attacks for as low as $7. Now, if you're just bored, for example, and just want to see what you can do with $7, which is less than what lunch generally costs, I mean, it's very easy to launch, and it's right there for the taking. And one other thing I want to mention here before we move on to the next slide is that downtimes are costly. This is just a conservative number that we see on the right side of the screen, which is a single hour of downtime would cost you around $300,000 US. Depending on what kind of services you're hosting, depending on who you are as a company or as an organization, depending on how many users you have, you will have a variation in the cost of downtime. So this obviously creates a huge problem, because if a DDoS attack takes you out for, let's say, 24 hours, you're going to lose a lot of money. And that's just the money, the brand reputation that's going to be damaged, the fact that your users are just going to be disgruntled and disappointed. That's just on top of the monetary issues. So this is a big problem. Now, moving on to the next slide, let's talk about the potential of DDoS attacks that's out there. So at A10 Networks, we have been doing our own research as well. We have a bunch of honeypots and sensors deployed across the globe to just skim through all the traffic that's going through them, trying to lure these attack botnets to kind of attack our own systems so that we can monitor the traffic. And we've seen that it is a global problem. It's not something that's related to one geographical location or one country or one city. We've seen that the attacks and the weapons that are used in the attacks are actually hosted all over the world, and they're used from all over the world in different ways in one single attack as well. So it's just, it's a global issue, and the scale is massive. So this data that we're seeing on the screen is from Q2 of this year, where we saw about 10 million potential DDoS weapons. Now, you might be asking, what's a potential DDoS weapon? These are any servers or services that are available on the internet with little to no protection. And these are easily usable in, reflection attacks or amplification attacks, where you send a request to a server, for example, a DNS resolver, and you spoof the response. You spoof the sender IP address in a way that the response goes to a different user. And what ends up happening is that the request is really small, but the response is like 10 or 20 times larger than the request. And when you keep bombarding a system with those requests those responses that it actually never requested, it's going to create problems, and it's going to bring those systems down really quickly. And that's part of the reason why amplification attacks are a favorite for DDoS attackers. And then add to that the fact that you have multi-vector attacks, where you can use different layers in the network and different kinds of protocols to attack. That's just going to create an even larger problem. And we saw that with Mirai, which was pretty famous a few years ago, which had, I think, 18 or 20 odd vectors involved in it, which was just unheard of at that time. But it was just 600 to 800 gigs. Now, fast forward to 2020, and at the beginning of the year, we saw the largest attack on record so far, which was 2.3 terabits that targeted AWS. Now, AWS is a big name. They took them out for a long time, and it cost them a lot of money, and it just created a lot of problems. And just imagine that was one protocol. That was one protocol-based attack. It was CLDAP. And as you can see on my screen, CLDAP in that quarter didn't even make it to the list on our side. So that just tells you that it was one vector. Imagine if it were multiple vectors, it would have been a massive attack. And by the way, the weapons, the potential weapons in our research have actually gone up by a couple of million. So right now it's somewhere between 12 to 13 million potential DDoS weapons out there. And then finally, I want to talk about the fact that there's an increase in complexity of these attacks. It's not as simple as just, amplifying the responses and spoofing someone's IP address and just bombarding them with responses they never asked for. It's also the fact that IoT devices that we talked about earlier, they're being hijacked and used in IoT botnets for what we like to call DDoS of things. And these IoT botnets can wreak havoc on anyone. And a lot of the times these attackers are using malware to hijack these IoT devices. But frankly, most of the times they don't even have to do that. The security on these IoT devices is so lax, and add to the fact that people don't necessarily change their default credentials. Most of what we've seen so far in our research is that people are just telnetting into these IoT devices with a set of default credentials and brute forcing their way into these devices. Once they have access, they add it to their botnet, and then whenever someone wants to launch an attack and hire their IoT botnet, they can easily use machines from all over the world. So yeah, these are some things that we are seeing with DDoS attacks, and the looming threat is there.
Barbara, what I think is really interesting is that what you mentioned as far as the impact on the cost and the impact on brand reputation when services from enterprise and when they're no longer available. I think now that schools have to depend on the critical link, to get to their resources, that they are now having to think more about that their brand and the cost to them if their students can't access their services from a DDoS attack. So I think this is extremely relevant for educational facilities as well.
Yeah, definitely. And we are going to look into some of the other issues specific to the education sector, where DDoS is not just used for bringing services down. So yeah, in the upcoming slides, we will talk about why someone would do a DDoS attack and how they would do it. So yeah, that's going to be interesting to look at.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the pandemic and how that has impacted university networks. And let me start with just kind of a general comment about service providers. and what we've seen from them, because we have a lot of infrastructure that's in mobile network operator networks, as well as cable operators and ISPs all over the world. And when the pandemic first hit and businesses and schools kind of sent everybody home, and everyone started working, playing, studying from their home location, it had an impact on service providers and the networks overall. There was kind of this big bump as far as the overall traffic volume, which I think was pretty well absorbed, when it first happened. There was some juggling around that different operators had to do. And that was a bump both in just the volume of traffic and the type of traffic, because there was a lot more streaming, a lot more, like communication services, video conferencing services, et cetera. But there was also just a significant shift in those usage patterns and where that traffic was coming from, and that tends to be a bigger problem for service providers. The diagram that you're seeing here is from Cloudflare, and it just illustrates the change in the traffic volume from what was the center of London, which would have been the business center, to now everywhere else, which is basically the suburbs. So as that usage shifts from being in the traditional locations like university campuses and or business centers and goes out to homes, service providers may or may not have all the infrastructure that they need to serve it from those particular locations. We've gotten calls from service providers initially about having to augment their carrier grade networking capacity because they had more broadband users and more broadband users using those services for longer periods of time, which ties up their IPv4 address pools and means that they have to get more, they have to make it or have to make it more efficient. So there was significant increases across the board in lots of different types of traffic uses. It changed not only the volume of traffic, but the type of traffic. So for universities that are sending their students out to their home locations, that they've had to accommodate this, I'm sure that there are some of you out there have had students that didn't have good access. They either didn't have broadband access, or was too slow, or possibly no access at all. And we've had a lot of calls from service providers trying to respond to that need of students now trying to access services from home. The other major impact that has, in fact, impacted everybody is just a general increase in all kinds of cyber activity as a result of the pandemic. Cyber criminals are really good at weaponizing whatever the news is, and the news now has been all about the pandemic and COVID-19. So there has been a big increase in cyber activity of all kinds, not necessarily new types of attacks, but attacks that now use COVID-19 messaging and their phishing emails, for example, to try to target what they see as vulnerable people who are less knowledgeable about cybersecurity, or are now working from home instead of an enclosed office or an enclosed campus where they had more protection from cyber criminals. There's a few examples here of like phishing emails that are going out for that pretend that they were the finance department of university, which I'm sure would get any student's attention very quickly. You can go to any country's government site, and they have probably warnings about different types of scams that are going on for COVID-19, and lots of information about how to protect yourself. The GSMA, for example, which is a mobile industry association, has published a number of reports and is actually actively tracking a lot of the fraud that is being conducted with text messages, which students use a lot of text messaging. So, and the FCC has been in the U.S. has been monitoring robocall scams and quite a bit as well. So there's just lots of different activities happening, more unsafe domains, and kind of the bottom line is that it has raised the awareness of everyone, the public sector, the service providers, individuals, consumers, businesses, of the need to have better cybersecurity and the need to have more resiliency in the networking so that they can continue to access services. So it's brought that very much to the public eye. and I think it's causing a lot of reform and rethinking of how they approach the security strategies. Barbara, would you like to say some more about how this relates to DDoS attacks?
Yes. So, I mean, it's not surprising that we've had a huge increase in DDoS activity, specifically in education and government sectors this year. And the interesting thing is that the trend for DDoS attacks on education have actually been following the academic year. So we saw a decrease around June and July in DDoS attacks as students were going, as students were not really active because it was summer break, a lot of these attacks did not happen. And part of the reason for that is because DDoS attacks also like to leverage the idea that they can blend in with legitimate traffic, so it's harder for systems to block these attacks. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the academic year. But yeah, we did see a large increase. In fact, according to Kaspersky, we saw an increase of about 350% this year in DDoS attacks. And people have been leveraging the uncertainty that's surrounding us, the fact that people at the beginning of the pandemic especially were very relaxed. They were kind of treating the whole time as a holiday. And that kind of led to the idea that people were just not really paying that much attention to the fact that attacks can happen. And along with malware attacks, we did see a rise in DDoS attacks as well. Now, if you click once more, I'm going to show an interesting headline, which was this is another kind of DDoS attack. So DDoS attacks, interestingly enough, don't necessarily only happen from the outside in. It's not just the bad guys out on the internet trying to bombard your systems with all kinds of traffic. We've increasingly seen students attacking their networks as well. In this particular news, in Florida, a teen actually DDoSed their high school because they didn't want to take a class, or maybe it was a test, and they just brought the whole network down. And obviously the teen was caught and he was reprimanded, and it was a big thing. But with the rise of things like e-gaming, we've seen a correlation of that with the fact that, you know, a lot of these students who are living on campus are actually bombarding their own networks just to disrupt, you know, someone else's video game. But yeah, a lot of the times we do see that these attacks happen because students are just not happy with the university or don't want to take a test, and they just DDoS the network. And as I mentioned earlier, it's so cheap and easy to launch these DDoS attacks. It costs next to nothing, and you know, students know this now. Everyone is tech savvy enough these days to know how to get around the internet and find these resources. And that's part of the reason why these attacks are more frequent, specifically in the education sector, because it's just so easy to bring networks down. Now going to the next slide. As I mentioned earlier, I want to talk a little bit about why someone would DDoS a network, or specifically a university network. Well, first of all, obviously, as I mentioned, someone doesn't want to take the test, someone doesn't want to be in class, someone just wants to bring the server down for some other nefarious reason. So disruption of services is definitely the key idea behind DDoS attacks, but it's not necessarily just that. DDoS is increasingly used as a smokescreen. And what I mean by that is people would DDoS a network to kind of create a distraction. So your security services are focused more, your security personnel are focused more on the DDoS attack. And in that time, some sort of a ransomware or a malware attack can slip through. And a part of that is also disabling the security infrastructure itself. A lot of the firewalls that are out there, they have this fail open capability. And what happens with that is when you start DDoSing those firewalls or the network, but it's the intention is to affect the firewall itself, they kind of fail open and let all the traffic through without any inspection at all. That's their coping mechanism, if you want to call it that. And with that, the issue that comes with it is that when they fail open, the bad guys can easily slip through ransomware. And why would they do ransomware? Well, ransomware is where the money is at. These days, ransomware is a very lucrative business for these attackers. We've seen attacks costing up to $1 million or a few million US dollars in attacks as part of ransoms that they're asking for. And then they ask for ransoms in Bitcoin, so they can't really be traced as well. And it's an increasing problem. And as the chart that I showed on the previous slide, we've also seen a similar trend with ransomware attacks as well. So all these attacks have started to kind of merge together. And these days we have something called the multi-layered attack, where you can front the attack with one kind of an attack, and then that can eventually lead to multiple other sorts of attacks, which can eventually infect your machines with malware, and that's just going to cause more problems than the simple attack would have. And then obviously boredom and the search for easy fame and notoriety, that are those things are also key factors, specifically for students and younger generation, the younger people out there, to just launch these attacks and see what they can do with what they've purchased or the code that they've written themselves. Now, how they would do these attacks, how they would launch them, there are multiple ways of doing them, and I've talked about some of these earlier as well. A lot of these softwares are available as freeware or open source code. I remember we had a copy of the Mirai code to analyze, but I mean, it's available on the internet, and it's been I think Mirai happened in 2016. It's 4 years down the line. We still see versions of Mirai on the internet with a little bit of tweaking of the code. So it was an open source code. It's out there. People can download it and use it for their own purposes. That's one of the things that's making it easy. DDoS for hire, as I mentioned, there are applications out there. You can go on the dark web, or you don't even have to go to the dark web and just buy a DDoS attack, and someone will, give you an IoT botnet that you can leverage for those attacks. And then those IoT botnets can be used for simple flooding attacks, or they can be used for, reflection or amplification attacks. You can be attacking the network layer. You can be attacking the application itself, or you can just have a huge IoT botnet and use it to flood the system in a way that it's a large volumetric attack, and the victim doesn't really have a chance to stand against it.
Thanks, Babar. So let's talk about some other trends that are impacting universities. Really, even before the pandemic, universities were under pressure to make changes to the traditional education paradigm. Over the last 8 years, college enrollment, this is in the U.S., nationwide, has fallen quite a bit. So most schools have been working on something to try to stem this falling enrollment, and the enrollment decline has been caused by a lot of factors external to the university. Changing demographics, there's just not as many people aren't having as many children anymore, so there's not as many young people entering the universities. A good economy also impacts the college enrollment, because if people are seeing good jobs in the economy, they may not feel as strong a need to do college education. And then there's also the high cost of education has strapped a lot of people and made education unreachable for some people. So most universities and colleges have already been working towards expanding the programs even before the pandemic. This framework is from Arizona State University, W.P. Carey, and it's describing how they've actually transitioned their program to what they now call an on-demand kind of campus. So it just kind of describes the trend from moving from a traditional on-campus to what they're calling full immersion or synchronous, which is on-campus plus remote, to also making on-demand service programs available as well. I mean, the on-campus is the traditional on-campus environment. We may have some satellite instructions, some satellite locations with live instructors, live interaction. It's highly structured. The on-campus plus remote is a combination of on-campus with allowing remote access with a live instructor and live interaction, and it's highly structured. On-demand is really more like an online university. Interaction is mostly over discussion boards or small group meetings, and it's highly flexible and allows the university to expand its education program to a broader audience. So I think most universities, most colleges are somewhere in between these different stages, and the pandemic has certainly pushed everyone to offer more and more remote access and online learning, and I think that the transition, will continue, and that universities will continue to expand their programs to allow this remote and on-demand type of learning structure. So in response to the pandemic and in response to other forces that have been kind of changing university structures as well, I think the priorities and the university networks of higher education will need to change as well. University environment is actually kind of like a small city. You have banking, you have security, you've got a lot of student services in addition to just the educational services themselves. So there's a lot of infrastructure, shopping, bookstores, and lots of data that's stored, about students. So the IT priorities in the past may have been more focused on trying to maintain this small city, maintaining that physical structure. Lots of colleges have older infrastructure that they're trying to maintain in their IT networks. And the focus has really been on keeping up with devices and traffic demand, as well as maintaining the compliance with the different regulatory compliances, also medical facilities, for example, that are typically on campus, or research hospitals. So IT has really had to try to provide lots of different types of services for many diverse functions within this campus environment. As it moved more towards an on-demand type model, such as what we saw from Arizona State University in the previous slide, the business strategy really kind of changes more from trying to recruit people as opposed to trying to expand access. And we think that the investment priorities are also changing, where now it's not so much, for example, managing your IPv4 addresses on campus as it is trying to extend global remote and on-demand access globally. Much greater focus on cybersecurity, much greater focus on making sure that network and services are available all the time. Bookstores may become online, medicine may even come online, as well as sports. And we see universities moving more towards cloud technology. Possibly less focus, there's less people on campus on the physical security, housing, and transportation that consumed a lot of university resources in the past. Barbara, did you want to add anything else to this?
Yeah, so as Terry mentioned, we have been seeing these trends. We have been seeing a move towards the on-demand model. We have been seeing that, people at least wanted to have an on-demand model that was parallel with what they had on campus. So you don't just have to, force students into making compromises on what they can get online versus what they can get on campus. You have to have these two parallel systems. And really, the whole COVID-19 pandemic has been a great wake-up call for everyone. I mean, even outside the education sector, it's been a big shocker. No one really expected it. but specifically within the education sector, because you have so many users within each network, it's just been that key driver, which is, in our opinion, it's going to be driving things for quite some time in the future.
I mean, most university IT networks were originally not built to support large-scale remote access. They were built to provide good services for students on campus. So that's a different IT structure to basically look like a web company.
Exactly, and that's what I'm trying to say. Like even the universities that did have on-demand education, it was mostly for, like, you know, if I'm talking about, for example, out of my experience from my own campus, we only had like a handful of courses, maybe 5 or 10 out of the 100 or so courses that we had that were only available to students online. Now all these educational institutes are forced to think about ways in which they can make everything available online, because we've seen now firsthand that we can have circumstances where none of our students can make it to the campus, and what's going to happen then? So you have to start preparing for that eventuality sooner than later.
Yeah, that high ability, that ability to be accessible all the time, and that high level has always been something that service providers, for example, have always had to adhere to. And now it's not only a nice to have for universities, it's essential to the business model, because this is the only, if that's the only way that students can access the services.
Exactly, yes.
So A10 provides a number of different capabilities that help universities move from their existing, from an on-campus focus to more of an on-demand or online focus, going forward. And we're going to talk about those in a couple minutes. And then, depending upon where you are in this continuum, different services might apply. But we have, in general, a threat protection system for DDoS detection and mitigation, carrier-grade networking for IPv4 management, as well as IPv4 and IPv6 migration. We have a firewall capability, as well as IPsec and SSLI, encryption, decryption, and ADC, which is application delivery controller capabilities that we offer to universities. So we'll talk about those next. So let me start with our Convergent firewall. So a version firewall, you see it on the right-hand side. It's what we call a software stack that incorporates a number of functions that provide security and scalability to data centers and or edge locations, or even to cloud locations as well. It combines a number of very commonly used functions that help secure and scale the network. This includes firewalls to filter out bad or malformed traffic. It includes carrier-grade networking, as I mentioned, which is IPv4 management, as well as the IPv4 and IPv6 migration. It includes ADC. It provides functions such as traffic steering, security gateway, if it's a mobile network, and IPsec VPN. It also includes integrated DDoS, which provides functionality that helps integrate the DDoS protection with your firewall function as well. DNS application firewall, and as well as deep packet inspections, and all combined with a centralized orchestration, automation, and analytics for Harmony with our Harmony controller. So the firewall has a number of different options. Whether you're on campus or on demand, you may need a different type of appliance. We have physical appliances as well as virtual, bare metal, and containers if you're looking for a cloud native or edge deployments. And some of our key features include scale-out cluster and flexible licensing, which provides a lot of flexibility for managing very uncertain times and where and how you have to deploy network services. The IPv4 management I mentioned before, we have a very robust set of capabilities. the CGNAT natting can extend your IPv4 addresses from like 40 to 60 times, and sometimes even more. And this is just an illustrative example of how many simultaneous connections you can expand if you still have IPv4 addresses that you're needing to manage. It also provides a mechanism to transition those users smoothly to IPv6. Barbara, do you want to talk about DDoS detection?
Yes, I'm going to quickly talk about this, and we actually got a question about how you can protect against these readily available DDoS attacks. So let me just give you a quick idea of what a DDoS attack or what a DDoS solution, DDoS protection solution needs to be in the future. Well, as I mentioned, these attacks are so readily available and so frequent, you need to have automation built into your solutions. You can't just depend on your security teams to kick in whenever there's an attack happening. And that's obviously going to create a lot of problems if you're just depending on these manual processes. So intelligent automation, machine learning, these things, artificial intelligence, these things need to be built into your systems. You have to have the ability to automatically, profile the traffic that's going through your network in peacetime, and then when an attack is happening, that way your artificial intelligence engines would be trained enough that they can easily differentiate in a surgical way between good traffic and bad traffic and stop the attacks. You have to have something called threat intelligence, which can be shared across multiple machines. If you have satellite campuses, for example, you want to have uniform policies and uniform security across all of your locations. And you have to have a solution that continuously learns from the traffic that it's experiencing. And that's where A10 Networks comes in. If we can go to the next slide. This is how our solution would generally work. We have something called DDoS threat intelligence, which kicks in immediately right at the edge when any kind of traffic comes into our solution. We are going to match it first with our threat intelligence feeds and see if any bad traffic is coming in from any known bad sources. If there is something like that, if it's coming from a known IoT botnet, we're going to block it right then and there. But then before that, our machines are automatically configured because they're automatically and continuously monitoring the traffic that's coming into the network and going out of the network. And that profile that it creates, the continuous profiling, that helps us create a baseline kind of a configuration. Now, as soon as an attack is detected, our traffic orchestration system kicks in. It's going to involve some of our DDoS attack mitigators into it. We have a 5-step mitigation escalation feature, which is automatic as well, where depending on the different levels, you can have different kinds of security policies applied, different kinds of security challenges that you can present to the machines that are trying to blend into the good traffic. And obviously, the higher you go, the stringiest or the more stricter the policies are, and the last level is generally where you're just blocking pretty much all the traffic, because at that point you have a major incident and you're trying to go into full-on protection mode instead of just figuring out what's going on. And then we also have something called zero-day pattern recognition, which is a machine learning-based algorithm, and that actually helps us monitor all the peacetime profiling that we are doing continuously. And based on that, we can take out the outliers from the traffic. We're using neural networks in there, which can actually help us model the good traffic and the bad traffic. And based on those models, we can feed our DDoS threat intelligence feeds, share it with our sister machines all over the world. And that way we have this whole system which kind of feeds from all the other nodes. And it helps us create a better automated defense for the next attack when it happens. And then after the fact, we do have automatic report generations, which gives you a very detailed look into when an attack happened, what was happening before the attack, when the attack started, what happened, what kind of protocols were used, which protocols were hit, which ports were hit, how we stopped the attack, and when, how long the attack happened, and so on. So that detailed logging and detailed reporting is also very important, because based on that, you can actually make adjustments to your machines. That's another way of learning from what's happening within your networks, so that you're better prepared for the next attack. And one thing that I'm not mentioning on this slide is your solutions definitely need to have high-scale capabilities as well. Because as I mentioned, the attacks are so huge these days that if an attack is much larger than what your box or what your security device can actually manage to handle, it's going to create problems as well, because your DDoS protection solution might go down. So you have to look into scale and resiliency, as Terry was mentioning earlier as well. You have to have high scale and highly resilient solutions which can help protect you in a better way from all these modern attacks that keep on evolving, because attackers are not going to sit down or slow down. Attacks are evolving. We need to evolve with them.
Thanks, Barbara. So just real quickly, because we're kind of running out of time here, just want to talk about some actual case studies that we've done in North America. First of all, there's been a couple of different universities where we continually get calls about they have IPv4 addresses and they need to expand them. They need to they either have more devices on campus, more kids with more devices, or they're using them more often, so the traffic's increasing, the devicing is increasing, and the IPv4 is just being exhausted. And that, for example, in the residential housing, and that's also true for the sporting events, where they have tons of people coming in for sporting events or in a centralized location, and it really overloads the campus Wi-Fi. So they found our solution to be very valuable to help them manage and extend the existing investment they have in IPv4 resources and in their IPv4 addresses. Barbara, do you want to say a little bit about this other East Coast university?
Oh, yes. So I want to talk about that, because they were our existing users of our CGNet solutions for IPv4 addressing, address management, etc., because they have more than 70,000 users, and each user on an average has 2 to 3 devices. So, the need for IP addresses was huge. But interestingly, they have been experiencing a lot of DDoS attacks during the COVID-19 pandemic. But even before that, they've been seeing a lot of attacks happening by e-gamers on campus, as I mentioned earlier. And this is a very good example of that, because they were having so many attacks. The disgruntled gamers were attacking the servers or attacking their own network so many times that they were pretty much in a perpetual and constant state of DDoS. And that's why they started looking for DDoS solutions, and they consulted us. And ever since they got our solution, they've really been happy. They haven't had a lot of problems with DDoS, and we've been protecting them from those ever since.
Great, thanks, Barbara. So finally, as I mentioned, we think the pandemic was a real wake-up call to lots of different institutions and organizations, including universities. But the improvisation and the legacy systems and security is just really, we don't see that as being able to be adequate going forward. And universities really need to have a well-thought-out plan to make their networks more resilient and to move closer to an on-demand model if they're not already there. But right now, there's actually an opportunity to do some upgrades while campus traffic is light. If you have sufficient IPv4 address pools, or you can check and see, now maybe it's time to augment them and to augment your existing capacity to include firewalls and ADC as you start planning for a broader on-demand type of model. And reminder again, universities are attractive targets for cyber criminals, and DDoS, as Barbara's mentioned, DDoS attacks keep increasing in size and frequency. So we see now DDoS protection as being essential, and that may not have been true for many universities in the past. Barbara, did you want to add anything?
No, I think you covered it well, Terry. I'm just going to reiterate that, the need for changing towards having a hybrid model, the need for having an equal and parallel on-demand system within the education sector has been highlighted by the pandemic. We know that right now is the perfect time to start making those changes, or at least start planning for those changes. We don't know how long this pandemic is going to be, and now that it has hit us, we don't know when the next big event is going to hit us. So with that in mind, we need to have that resiliency built into our networks. We need to have proper security infrastructure in place for all kinds of different attacks. We need to make sure that we are ready for whatever comes next.
Yeah, and I think that products like our Convergent Firewall, which consolidates a lot of different functions into one software stack, is really helpful as universities make that transition, because they may need different products and they can then use the same appliance or VMs to accommodate different functions as their IT needs change.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we provide an industry-leading solution for higher education with application delivery, 5G services for mobile operators, DDoS protection and traffic visibility, cutting-edge secure application services, multi-cloud and 5G, zero trust, and automation. And this is a list of all of our products here. So we want to thank you very much, and I don't know if we have any time for any questions.
Well, thank you, Terry.
Kevin?
Yeah, thanks very much, Terry and Barbara. That was a really incredible presentation with a lot of information, a lot of scary information. The perpetual and constant DDoS attacks may be a nightmare for me in the upcoming days here. We do have a couple questions, and then we can sneak in. I guess when we're talking about the DDoS, isn't DDoS protection provided by service providers? Is there really a need for on-premises DDoS protection?
So I'll take that. Yeah, that's a bit of a misconception, and it's a very common question that we keep getting from all sorts of different organizations. Yes, the service provider is supposed to give you DDoS protection, but if you're relying just on the service provider for complete protection, that's going to be a problem. And the reason for that is because service providers generally don't have inline solutions specifically because of scale. Inline solutions can't really scale that high that a service provider can use them in that way. So obviously, we have something called reactive deployments where the DDoS protection would only become inline and only kick in an event of an attack. Now, having said that, that's going to create big problems because those solutions generally are geared towards volumetric attacks. So as I mentioned, there are different kinds of DDoS attacks, and if the attack is small enough, it's not going to trigger those mechanisms to start the volumetric defense, and you're going to end up having your applications being brought down even if you have a cloud-based or a service provider-based solution. So the perfect solution in a perfect world for this is a hybrid solution where you have an on-prem component and you have protection provided by the service provider, and there's some sort of a link between the two. But having on-prem DDoS protection within your data centers is very important. Interesting.
Terry, you were mentioning in the presentation earlier about the transition from IPv4 to IPv6. If v4 is eventually going to go away, does it make more sense for universities to change out their networks now for version 6?
Well, I think they should certainly have a plan, for moving to IPv6, and because there's probably a lot of, general efficiencies and economies they'll get within their older infrastructure anyway if they move update their IT infrastructure. But for most universities and most businesses, for that matter, it's really a cost decision. I mean, if they have adequate IPv4 addresses and they can, extend them with our technology, for example, which we are the leading provider of a carrier-grade networking technology. to service providers as well as the enterprise. If they can do that, it's really kind of like at what point does it make economic sense to make that change? And if budgets are tight, they might as well extend the IPv4 infrastructure. But I think definitely there should be a plan, because it may take a few years to really move everything to IPv6. And so I think there should be a plan, but they should you do what makes most economic sense for the university.
Right. Now, what seems like a million years ago, but was only last year, like the 5G, the adoption of 5G was probably the biggest trend or topic talked about in higher ed tech. And even though we're in the middle of this madness of the pandemic, those technologies are still going forward as well. How will the deployment of 5G by mobile operators impact university IT?
Well, first of all, I think that the pandemic has actually accelerated 5G deployment, and most of the operators that we work with, there may have been like a temporary pause while they tried to kind of figure out what was happening, but really it just shows the need for high performance mobile access wherever. So I think it has accelerated deployment, maybe increased deployment in some cases where there is no fixed access. So because 5G can be used very effectively as a fixed wireless substitute instead of broadband access. A lot of rural areas don't have that kind of broadband access, and a lot of countries don't have that. So I think it will make remote areas and other areas more accessible with 5G for the universities, so maybe they can reach students that they couldn't reach before with adequate access. And I think the other thing that 5G also introduces is a real shift in the business models of how service providers and other types of organizations interact, because 5G can be private as well. So I would suspect that we would start seeing a collaboration between universities and service providers, much like there are with businesses on exploring 5G, new 5G use cases like telemedicine, for example. I mean, you have research hospitals, in a lot of universities. So that kind of private LTE or that private 5G or private mobile networks is something that businesses are exploring with SPs, and I would expect universities would have additional options to look at that going forward as well.
Right. Now, Babar, adding to my nightmares, in your presentation, you talked about the threats to university infrastructure due to the rapid growth of Internet of Things and devices such as drones being connected to Internet of Things. And I see bad actors getting control of drones and spying on dorms or even worse. Can you go a little bit more into what that threat is to the infrastructure?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, it's just so easy to hijack these devices, and you have so many of these IoT devices deployed across households, deployed across universities, everywhere. Like we have these IoT devices that are just so, in some cases, so unnecessary, but we have everything connected to the internet. And then again, as I mentioned, there's a human component to this as well, which is, you have all these users who are just not really changing any of the default settings. And a lot of these vendors, they might have different names on the front, but at the back end, it's the same hardware, it's the same software, right, with a little bit of a different front end for all of these. So if an attacker knows the default credentials for one of them, they can brute force their way out of many, they can brute force their way into many of these devices. And as I mentioned, the scale that they provide, the power that they provide to these attacks is so massive that it has the ability to bring down anything and everything. And that's the future that we're looking at. As I mentioned, it sounds a little bleak, but we have solutions like the A10 Networks DDoS protection solution, where we have the ability to stop these attacks. So it's not like all is lost. It is a big risk. It is a big threat that our networks are facing, but it's manageable. With the proper policies, with the proper solutions, it is easily manageable.
Well, I think it's best to end with the glass half full like that. So thank you.
Yeah.
I see our time is up, so we just want to wrap things up here. If you submitted a question that we didn't get to in the Q&A portion, someone from A10 will follow up with you directly. Once again, I'd like to thank our presenters today for a very informative presentation. And I'd like to thank all of the audience members for joining us as well. As a reminder, you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to this recording, along with the slides. Thanks again for participating and have a great day.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kevin.
Bye.